Welcome to A Verse, a podcast about poetry for the lovers and the loathers. A podcast about poetry, which really means a podcast about life, words, beauty, nature, love, loathing, loss, rhythm and rhyme, about everything and nothing, and all that falls between. There are poets I've loved since childhood, and poets who are newer to me, but no less important or dear to my heart, and one of the latter is William Stafford. How could I not have known about Stafford sooner, I sometimes wonder. Think of all the joy I could have derived over the years. So I make up for the lost time by reading him voraciously, which is necessary because, along with being one of the most beloved American poets of the 20th century, he is also one of the most prolific. For the last 20 years of his life, Stafford wrote a poem almost every day, usually after coming home from his daily walk. How could he keep up that pace? He had an answer to that question that I often return to for solace and encouragement in my own daily creative work. Here was his advice: lower your expectations. Now, you should know Stafford is one of the most highly regarded poets of the past century, especially by other poets. His dear friend, the poet and essayist and activist Robert Bly, wrote a poem shortly after Stafford's passing that captures the depth of affection he held for his friend. Here's the last paragraph of that poem, which I just love. If all a man does is to watch from the shore, then he doesn't have to worry about the current. But if affection has put us into the stream, then we have to agree to go where the water goes. What a beautiful description of life and love, friendship, creativity, spirituality, anything and everything that matters. Because if all we do is watch from the shore, we don't have to worry about the current. But we will also never get our feet wet or see beautiful fish or coral reefs, let alone swim or swim a long way. Often, Bly understands, it is affection that puts us into the stream. And when it does, we can't fight the current. We need to let ourselves go where the currents of life and love and friendship, creativity and spirituality take us. And that's how we stop watching and begin the journeys that matter. Bly would, of course, have known one of my favorite Stafford poems. It's called Ask Me. Sometime, when the river is ice, ask me mistakes I have made. Ask me whether what I have done is my life. Others have come in their slow way into my thought, and some have tried to help or to hurt. Ask me what difference their strongest love or hate has made. I will listen to what you say. You and I can turn and look at the silent river and wait. We know the current is there, hidden, and there are comings and goings from miles away that hold the stillness exactly before us. What the river says, that is what I say. This is also a poem about how affection changes the currents of our lives. Not the strongest love or hate, but the quiet companionship of sitting together and sharing a common experience. We can look at our lives as a series of events that make up a human history, often full of mistakes. We can look at life as a series of human interactions that harmed or healed us. Or we can find the few people and practices in our lives with whom or which we can find common ground and a quiet peace. And we can choose how we see the world. What the river says, a silent, ice-covered river, clearly in this poem, a river that is still made up of water underneath, shows us that we can choose to fight or fear or to flow. There's a story I've always loved about a frozen river in the middle of winter, and this river has become solid ice. Nothing is flowing. It feels cold and dead to the world. But still, the river remembers its true self. It remembers what it felt like to flow, and it wants to flow again. But how? It's solid ice. Then the days start to get longer, and the river begins to feel the sun again. And when it does, when it feels the sun, something starts to loosen up. Could it be starting to flow again? But then nighttime comes, and it returns to all ice. And it grows fearful. Will it stay ice? And so it goes. Hope, ice, ice, hope, ice. Will anything ever change? But each day the sun shines a bit longer, and the river dares to hope a bit more. Each night as the ice solidifies, yes, it feels disheartened. But then one spring day there is a crack. And another crack. And suddenly, seemingly all at once, the ice begins to break up and the river feels itself flowing. And then, almost as if by magic, all that ice that felt so solid, so real, so true is gone. What happened? Why did that one day of sunshine dispel all that ice? Well, of course it wasn't that one day of sunshine, but all the days of sunshine that showed the river, bit by bit, that all rivers flow. But in order to flow, we have to step in. We have to step into the journeys of our lives, and to do that, we need to remember Stafford's advice. We need to lower our expectations. So why, you may ask, is that a good thing? Shouldn't we have high expectations? Well, unsurprisingly, in a blog about poetry, it comes down to word choice. Expectations are a strong belief that something will happen or be the case in the future. Well, what's wrong with that, you may ask? The first thing wrong with it is that it takes us out of the present and puts us in both the future and the past. Future thinking often conjures up fear. Past thinking often makes us remember fear. How often do we fear what might happen instead of just sitting in the gratitude of being all right here, right now? Because most of the time, right here, right now, in this present moment, in the now, we are all right. Sometimes, of course, expectations may conjure up excitement, but that excitement can also create pressure. What if that vacation, this marriage, that new house isn't all I hope it will be? Expectations, the writer Anne Lamott also says, create resentments. We often resent whatever or whomever causes something not to work out as we expected it would. Then we load that into the pile of mental burdens we carry with us wherever we go. So how about replacing high expectations with high standards or ideals? Ideals that keep us present right here, right now, in our own hearts. This is the difference between the joy you get from choosing to go out each evening to enjoy a sunset. Each evening, just choosing to go out and enjoy the sunset, however it looks from wherever you are, or driving for 3 hours to get to the perfect beach for the perfect sunset, only to find out not only is it raining, but you also missed the beauty of the whole drive getting there in your hurry not to miss the sunset. So, what did Stafford mean by lowering your expectations? Well, to best explain, let's look at what I call the 5 Ps. The first 3 Ps are 3 things that block so many of us from showing up to our own journey. They are the high expectations of perfectionism, which leads to procrastination, which eventually results in paralysis. So perfectionism. We want something so badly that we put that thing or person or place or achievement on a pedestal and see it as savior and saint. But we know we're not savior or saint material, so how could we possibly see ourselves doing something like that? We can't. And what happens next is then procrastination. We've all been there. Knowing perfection isn't an option on the first page of our novel, but truly believing that it is our only goal, we procrastinate. Suddenly we find every reason not to try writing that first page, because if we can't be J.D. Salinger out of the blocks, then we'd rather do something with no pressure, like the laundry. Eventually, as we keep choosing the laundry over the first crappy words of the first page of our book, or doing taxes over going out on a date, we fall into paralysis. And by looking back at what we keep not doing, we are turned into those proverbial pillars of salt. So how do we break that cycle? We follow Stafford's advice. He said, "There is no such thing as writer's block for writers whose standards are low enough." We lower our standards and embrace the final two P's, practice and purpose. Practice and purpose are the antidotes to perfection, procrastination, and paralysis. Practice is doing something instead of just talking about doing something, and it is doing it daily, deliberately, consciously, and with commitment. We practice writing 2 words, then 4. We practice getting up and walking to the end of the block and eventually around the block. We practice meditation for 2 minutes, then 3, then maybe 10, and we keep practicing every day. Practice really is a magic pill. I wrote a whole book about how practice totally changed me from a miserable, paralyzed, perfectionist workaholic to someone who actually felt joy again every single day by creating a daily practice of joy. Because when we practice something, we actually feel what we've been wanting to feel but have talked ourselves into believing we'll never feel. Instead of talking about writing but believing we can't write, we are writing, even if it's 2 words. We are walking, we are meditating, we are reaching out to a friend. And we see then that we can do these things that we have persuaded ourselves are impossible. Add purpose into the mix and you're cooking with gas. What is purpose? Well, let William Stafford tell you in his poem, The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread. But it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. Purpose is holding onto the thread you have never lost hold of, even though perfectionism and procrastination and paralysis persuade you otherwise. Purpose is understanding that the thread is everything. Purpose is the through line that holds you to the promise of your own heart. But when you feel like you've lost that thread, when you're persuaded that you've lost your purpose, what do? Well, here's the real secret of today's whole podcast. You can't. You may forget you're holding it, but you never lose it. That's what Stafford says. You don't ever let go of the thread. You can hear that line in a couple of different ways, like an admonition, a mother saying to their child, "You don't ever let go of my hand. You don't ever let go of that thread." But you can also hear it as a promise. You don't ever let go of that thread. You may forget you're holding it, but you can never lose it. You can't. It's just that sometimes you have to lose the things you thought mattered to remember the things that really do. I wrote a whole book about that, too, called The Way of Being Lost. And the title of that book came from this poem, another of Stafford's poems that gives you everything you need to know about the 5 Ps. It's called Cutting Loose. Sometimes, from sorrow, for no reason, you sing. For no reason, you accept the way of being lost. cutting loose from all else and electing a world where you go, where you want to. Arbitrary, a sound comes, a reminder that a steady center is holding all else. If you listen, that sound will tell you where it is, and you can slide your way past trouble. Certain twisted monsters always bar the path. But that's when you get going best. Glad to be lost. Learning how real it is here on earth again and again. Oh my God, I love that poem. That poem showed me that sometimes I had to be willing to jettison the stories that were keeping me stuck in the practice of being a perfectionist, which made me procrastinate and become paralyzed. And I had to choose to create a new practice. And that practice became getting lost, losing the old stories, understanding that when those twisted monsters bar my path, which they do all the time, that's when I get going best. Glad to be lost, because only by being lost can I learn how real it is here over and over again. And that is the practice of being alive. Oh my gosh, there are so many poems that Stafford wrote that I could share with you. One of them, perhaps my most favorite, is called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. Reading that poem to a friend or having them read it to you once a week is a practice I think we should actually all engage in. It's one of the most powerful poems I've ever read. But instead of reading it to you, I'm going to maybe suggest you find it for yourself. Find a ritual to read to each other and read it out loud to someone you love and have a conversation about it. And maybe share what surfaced for you here, if you will. But instead, I'm going to end today's podcast with a much simpler poem. One that I think gives a beautiful response to all our worries about having lost the threads of purpose and meaning and hope and love in our lives and in the world. Because if, like Stafford, you commit to writing a poem today, you can't always write an epic poem like A Ritual to Read to Each Other. Sometimes what comes through is much simpler. And sometimes the simple things are what remind us of what is really true. On the days where we feel like all that is good, our hope, our youth, a world that could come together and sing with Michael Jackson or in a Coca-Cola ad about coming together and saving the world, all that we believe is gone forever, we have to remember the sweet moments like this in this poem once in the 1940s. We were alone one night on a long road in Montana. This was in winter, a big night, far to the stars. We had hitched, my wife and I, and left our ride at a crossing to go on. Tired and cold, but brave, we trudged along. This, we said, was our life. Watched over, allowed to go where we wanted. We said we'd come back sometime when we got rich. We'd leave the others and find a night like this. Whatever we had to give, and no matter how far, to be so happy again. The person inside each of us who could be that happy, who could love the world without reservation, who could trust that they're watched over, who could trust that they are being led, who could wear life like a loose garment and let themselves be led by hope and faith instead of fear, that person is still there in each of us. Because the person who knew that kind of happiness and still remembers that happiness and love and simplicity and a big, wide open sky, the person who remembers that those things are the only things that really matter is still in you. You are still that person. I am still that person. We are still that world who could sing "We Are the World" together. And that is the thread of our purpose. Thank you for listening to A Verse, a podcast about poetry and purpose and practice, about everything and nothing and all that falls between. Poetry for the lovers and the loathers, the hopers and the healers. Thank you for listening.